Every year, the U.S. intelligence community comes together and releases an annual threat assessment. This year's report covers a range of challenges across the world, from China to Russia, Iran to North Korea, and even non-state threats like climate change and health security. This report gives a good picture of what the U.S. is assessing as threats in the near term, and that helps identify where the priorities in defense will be aligned moving forward. There's a lot to go over, so let's go through this report and hit all the important bits of this 40-page unclassified threat assessment. This will be a long video, so I'll be making each section a chapter for ease of reference. Also, each country has similar sections assessing political objectives, military, WMD, space, tech, economics, cyber, and malign influence operations. The foreword sets a picture for the world that this threat assessment is analyzing. In it, the world continues to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic, while at the same time being pulled into different poles, where the US exists at the end of the Western sphere and China exists on the opposite end. Russia is noted with their invasion of Ukraine. However, we'll see a theme throughout this assessment that their conventional power is waning and that they'll have to rely on unconventional power to achieve their national objectives. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. China is set as a primary near-peer competitor for this assessment, with the capability to match the US in many domains today and have the ability to match or even overmatch the US in the very near future. That's likely why they begin this report with China, so let's get going. The IC assesses China's near-term goals as aligned under Xi Jinping's goals to make China, quote, a preeminent power in East Asia and major power in the world stage. They cite 4 lines of effort that they assess China will attempt to achieve this objective through. They will work to press Taiwan on unification, undercut US influence, drive wedges between Washington and its partners, and foster norms in favor of authoritarianism. They also mention a secondary line of effort to reduce tensions with Washington when they believe it suits their national interests. In other words, China will seek to compete directly with the US in East Asia and beyond, but it does not want to risk a direct confrontation. We'll see this through the next few pages, how they'll seek to do this on a whole-of-country approach, not just a whole-of-government, meaning basically that private Chinese companies will also act as a lever to forward the government's objectives instead of acting as individual entities working on their own interests, kind of like what you see in Western countries. The next 3 paragraphs certainly provide an interesting look into what the IC assesses China themselves believe, what they're doing, and the impacts of their actions that they're beginning to have to reckon with. The first paragraph breaks down how Beijing views the US as adversarial to China, and that the US will use its combined power to counter growing Chinese influence and undermine the CCP. The second paragraph breaks down how China is working to develop and join its growing military, economic, technological, and diplomatic powers together to strengthen the CCP rule and influence abroad. Finally, the third paragraph shows how China is facing growing domestic and international challenges as a reaction to their implemented economic and foreign policy strategies. China's primary foreign policy objectives are assessed to run on 3 main lines of effort. The first and most important to the CCP being the unification of Taiwan, the second being the territorial claims in the South China Sea, and the third being the rehabilitation of the Belt and Road Initiative and new flagship programs called the Global Development Initiative and the Global Security Initiative. These programs will all follow similar tracks to what the Belt and Road Initiative has driven in the past, where China can leverage foreign investment to develop closer ties and gain political concessions. Militarily, China continues to develop its conventional capabilities, with the primary goal of being able to confront the US in a large-scale, high-intensity conflict. This is not a statement that China is preparing to go to war with the United States, just that if a war did break out, that they wish to actually fight toe-to-toe with the United States. One of the most notable developments here has been the development of the PLA Navy. This is something that many folks both within the US defense sector and OSA community have spoken out about. China is rapidly developing and exercising its capacity for shipbuilding, where China will be able to produce modern warships and a capacity to overmatch the US Navy in Eastern Asia. China already maintains a high lethal and effective rocket artillery corps, which enables it to deny entire areas in the event of conflict with the US Navy. However, the further development of the PLA Air Force and PLAN really open a number of options for the Chinese military with regards to Taiwan and the South China Sea. The report continues to discuss WMD development, and this is another area where China is making rapid progress in developing its capabilities. The IC report notes that Chinese leaders believe their current capabilities to be insufficient, and that they'll need to grow those capabilities to to compete with the United States and Russia. They're also believed to not be interested in agreements that would limit or lock their current WMD position, which indicates that they're currently in the mindset of proliferation before limitation, until they can match what they believe to be the current United States WMD capability. This transitions to space, where China is making a whole-of-country approach towards developing its presence in space, with the civilian government, military, and corporate sectors each working in their own programs. These efforts include lunar missions, orbital missions, satellite reconnaissance, and counter-satellite operations, and more. With all the concern over Taiwan, an under-discussed element of what a future US-China conflict would look like is the disruption to space operations and the ability for the US to leverage its satellite assets as a result of Chinese counter-satellite operations. This weaves into technology and economics, which is a hugely important domain for China in the near to medium term, as it works in other domains. China's long-standing strategy has basically been to have their cake and eat it too, where Chinese firms can be protected from the international competition while still having access to international markets. China also will continue its efforts to collaborate with the US and allied nations firms to gather trade secrets and technology that it can use at home. The EIC report also outlines how growing domestic challenges may force China to begin making tough decisions in where it chooses to invest its money, as the cash pool may not be as expansive as in years past, and the price point for progress is growing further and further. A significant development within the past year was President Biden's decision to bring home US semiconductor research and expertise from China, which has significantly impacted China's ability to produce semiconductors on its own. That said, the report notes China maintains some key advantages that could over time shorten the gap between the US and China and, given time, overtake the US. For instance, China's current manufacturing capacity outmatches the United States, and the IC report also notes that China has access to rare earth element mining that the US simply does not possess. This has caveats, for instance. The report states that if China were to use export controls over rare earth elements against the US or its allies for political leverage, the growth of alternative means or substitutes would be quickened. The next domain is cyber, where the IC shares that China maintains the broadest and most active persistent cybersecurity threat to the US and its partners. The two primary areas to note here is direct and indirect, where direct would be how China is observed to possess the greatest ability to disrupt US and allied critical infrastructure in the event of a war. And indirect would be where China possesses robust and advanced tools for surveillance and espionage. Finally, for China, we have malign influence operations. We'll get into how this section works for Russia soon, as China is observed to largely work out of Russia's playbook, in part because of how successful that playbook has been historically. The primary lines of effort here are to sow doubts about US leadership, both internally within the US, but also among the global community, while also bolstering the image of China as a world power. A huge topic in this specific conversation has been TikTok and the leveraging of its user base and algorithm to pursue these objectives, both on the user feed and outside of the app, by using data from users on other platforms. With China as the principal near-peer threat outlined here, let's move on to the next greatest threat. As of the time of this report, the IC has had a little over a year to observe the impacts of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where they can better assess the impacts that the invasion is having on Russia's global standing, but more relevant here, on Russia's decision-making and capabilities. A major theme we're going to see likely over the next several years is the impact that this war is having on Russia's ability to pursue its objectives around the world, but also in the post-Soviet space as well. With the majority of its conventional military force, to include its unconventional forces like Wagner, tied down in the war in Ukraine, Russia is much less strategically flexible than before the war. You may remember the 2020 Russian intervention in the Belarusian protests, or the 2022 Russian intervention in the Kazakhstan protests. These forces that Russia used for those interventions don't really exist anymore. The units that Russia sent have been destroyed, reconstituted, worn down, backfilled with mobilized conscripts, and worn down further. The same picture plays out with Wagner, which Russia has used extensively throughout the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. With Wagner and the Russian military focused on Ukraine, Russian assets abroad are more or less left as a skeleton crew, and this can be felt in places like Nagorno-Karabakh, where Russia acts as a peacekeeping force between Armenia and Azerbaijan. If Russia has no means to enforce that peace, then the peacekeeping force is toothless, and history has shown time and time again what tends to happen next. Still, Russia remains powerful and capable, if not conventionally so. Russia still maintains a large nuclear stockpile, a large oil and natural gas industry, and a large and robust unconventional regime. They are still able to pursue their objectives abroad. However, they'll have to be more creative and unpredictable in doing so. The IC report notes that Russia doesn't want to go to war with NATO, and has made efforts to avoid direct confrontation. However, the war in Ukraine has left opportunities for mistakes to be made. The report also opens with a small section here for their invasion of Ukraine, noting that they assess Russia hasn't met the objectives that Putin initially set. This is all stuff that we talk about in the weekly reports and some of the other Russia-Ukraine videos I make, so you can go check those out for more information. Militarily, we've already discussed the massive commitment of Russian forces to the war and the huge level of losses that their top combat forces have sustained. This report jumps off of that by assessing that Russia still maintains the capability to use naval, bomber, and its ICBM fleet to leverage its nuclear stockpile, which is something that they'll probably rely on more and more in the future to put pressure. And no, that's not saying that they'll start nuking people, it's just saying that the threat of nuclear war is enough to scare targets into concessions. This is a note that sums up the WMD section, where Russia's only real parity with the US today is in its nuclear stockpile. In conventional strength, they've largely regressed, and by a large margin in some pretty key areas. Another key area of strength for Russia is cyber as well as malign influence operations. Before the war, Russia possessed some of the most famous hacking outfits with some pretty significant cyber campaigns under their belts. These forces have largely been committed to the war, with their levels of success beginning to stagnate against critical infrastructure. However, they still remain a potent threat beyond Ukraine and into greater Europe and the US. With malign influence operations, Russia marks one of the premier actors in achieving its objectives via influence campaigns. Russia has a long history of capitalizing on domestic tensions to drive anger and division, which can be a vulnerable environment for disinformation campaigns. For instance, the report notes US elections, as well as other significant domestic flashpoints to stoke fear and anger. This is likely an avenue of approach that China can pick up from in their own influence operations, not because of the close relationship between Russia and China and what could be a close relationship between their intelligence entities, but also because of how effective those operations have been in an informational environment like what the US has. This was a point made during the congressional briefing that paired with the release of this specific report. Finally, onto space, Russia continues to operate its own space program. However, it's certainly less robust than in previous years. The primary threat that Russia poses is in anti-satellite warfare. However, beyond that, their space program is one of the more heavily impacted sectors from the war and subsequent economic struggles. With China and Russia noted, the report looks further towards two regional threats that are certainly no less dangerous and capable. Iran has grown in its threat level over recent years, most notably with the development of its nuclear program to far exceed civilian applications. This section opens basically by noting that concern. However, it then transitions quickly towards the recent wave of protests throughout Iran. The report notes that it's tracking the Iranian government's belief that these protests are foreign-sponsored. However, it also notes that these protests started due to cultural issues and quickly began to encompass other grievances, expanding into political and economic concerns. This section wraps with the prediction that a stagnating economy and growing inflation will continue to stoke protests, even that the Iranian government will struggle to address them even if the current round is successfully stifled with violence and intimidation. Militarily, Iran's key capabilities are in its hybrid warfare suite. What this means is that Iran has a significant network of partners and proxies across the Middle East that it can leverage to pursue national interests and maintain strategic depth. Iran does also possess capable conventional forces like the IRGC and its ballistic missile suite. However, their pursuit to grow these conventional capabilities are also going to struggle due to the economic turmoil. Iran is also known to be pursuing the development of hybrid networks within the United States. This is an objective the report notes that Iran has sought for over a decade, and has recently pivoted toward the development of capabilities that'd allow for US-based attacks on current and former US leadership since the US bombing of the IRGC chief Qasem Soleimani in 2020. One of the largest concerns with Iran comes from its nuclear program. While the report does not assess that Iran is committed to the development of nuclear weapons, it does note that it could choose to do so if the US does not re-enter into the JCPOA and fulfill its end of the agreement and provide sanctions relief. It also notes that, in the meantime, Iran has continued to pursue elements of nuclear production beyond the limits of the JCPOA. However, none of these, with one exception, indicate the imminent development of a testable nuclear weapon. That one exception being the enrichment of U-235, which, if you watch my How the US Got Its Nukes video, you'd know that you need to undergo a significant enrichment process to isolate the rare U-235 for military use. According to reports earlier this year, Iran has continued this enrichment and is getting close to meeting the 80 to 90% enrichment threshold that's required for nuclear weapons development. This section wraps with Iran's cyber capabilities, outlining how Iran is growing in its aggressiveness and willingness to attack countries with stronger capabilities like the US or Israel. Iran is one key regional threat in this report, but the next is North Korea. At present, the threat posed by North Korea largely comes from their nuclear forces, as Kim Jong-un believes this to be the principal guarantor of North Korean security against the US. The report cites that, militarily, North Korea is working to further develop its ICBM fleet to defeat US and South Korean missile defense networks and even target the United States mainland. Their belief is also that, as time goes on, so too will global acceptance that North Korea is a nuclear power. The key to this program beyond its deterrent capability is the leverage that it buys with threats. North Korea can use the threat of nuclear weapons use to gain political concessions and sanctions relief if it catches the US or South Korea at a bad time. This doesn't always work, however, and when it doesn't, North Korea instead turns to its cyber forces, where it's able to engage in cybercrime. North Korea's cybercrime is so lucrative that North Korea is able to use it to bypass some of the impacts of sanctions. With the main global and regional rivals outlined, the report now shifts towards shared threats that the US, as well as the rest of the world, to include its rivals face, with the first being climate change. Here the report outlines a future where states compete for resources and water, as well as positioning to control more arable land and area in the Arctic. With natural disasters linked to climate change increasing, the risk of population movements as a result increase the risks to surrounding countries and the world. One example would be the floods in Pakistan, which displaced millions of people. Interestingly, the report specifically names China and India as threats exacerbating climate change, being that they are the number 1 and 3 largest CO2 emitters, as they each heavily rely on cheap coal for their electricity production. The second largest CO2 emitter is the United States, and I don't see a sentence here on the US contribution to climate change, though that's likely out of the scope for this report since this is really a report of external threats. The health security section largely covers the COVID pandemic, from both the continued threat that it does pose for certain populations as well as the fallout from 2020. This report cites the economic ripple that we're continuing to see spread from the pandemic, and how that ripple could disrupt economic development and economic security. Another interesting note here is that the IC assesses that after witnessing the poor levels of preparedness that countries have for threats like a pandemic, adversaries may invest more heavily in the development of biological weapons that could be used to exploit that lack of preparedness with a more lethal effect. The report then shifts into transnational issues, which face everyone globally and range from WMDs to AI. Starting with AI, the report assesses the prospect of unidentified threats as a result of AI research. They also note that adversaries understand the utility of AI and are working to develop and leverage their own AI capabilities for use in economics, military, and espionage. An interesting note is on the biotechnology and genetic testing, where they say China is collecting genetic data on its population for study and research. It concludes with the assessment that rival semiconductor and AI development could help lead to breakthroughs in research and help create a technological advantage over the US. This transitions into the threat of digital authoritarianism, where they describe how adversaries' control over data sets and user bases could outpace controls to protect digital freedom. Again, we've talked a little bit about TikTok, but this feels like another jab at TikTok and similar applications. submarines. Skipping nuclear proliferation because we all know what that is, and it's really only one paragraph describing the threat that we already know, and we've already talked more in depth on this with specific countries. We get to economic fallout from the Russia-Ukraine war. There are two main sectors that get hit here that impact two main demographics: energy, which largely impacts Europe, and food, which largely impacts poorer countries. Europe is still undergoing changes in its energy imports. However, by and large, it's still a challenge that Europe faces. Without a replacement to pull energy from, Europe will likely continue to struggle with meeting the demand. For food, both Russia, but also very much Ukraine, exported a significant percentage of global agriculture, with one of the primary beneficiaries being poorer countries. With the Russian blockade of Ukrainian ports and the impact of the war on agricultural yield, poorer countries are facing challenges in food security. There have been efforts made to relieve this impact by developing agreements between Russia, Ukraine, and third parties like Turkey to ensure safe export of Ukrainian agricultural and food products from the port of Odessa. However, with the eastern half of Ukraine still being heavily contested, the output that Ukraine can provide will be greatly reduced, and this could cause problems globally. This moves into a section on migration, which largely talks about Central America since that's the most pressing challenge for the US. Some of the main threats here are the economic cost to countries where migrants pass through, where governments either aren't willing or aren't able to meet the needs of the people, which causes more folks to move north in hopes of better prospects. Another is criminal organizations, which will extort migrants, kidnap them, or other bad things, as migrants unfortunately aren't protected very well on their way north. Finally, they note xenophobia as a threat across the world as migrants reach new countries in search of safety and a future, and they interact with citizens of the host nation who aren't very fond of immigration or other cultures. This could lead to tension or violence. Next, the report hits on criminal organizations and terrorist groups. It notes criminal organizations as a threat, however it doesn't name any specific organizations that pose an acute threat. It notes that for US security, Mexican-based criminal organizations pose a threat from drug production to distribution, as well as violence. For terrorist organizations, it mentions the main players like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and Hezbollah. ISIS remains a threat across the Middle East, but may undergo some disruptions due to deaths of key leadership in 2022 and their conflict with the Taliban in Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda may struggle to maintain its posture as it seeks asylum in Iran and tries to find its footing in Afghanistan under the new Taliban rule. Interestingly, the report notes that Al-Qaeda appears less interested in attacks on the US homeland and more on US persons and facilities in the Middle East, as opposed to ISIS with their interest in attacking the US anywhere. The report then transitions to racially motivated extremism. While the report also doesn't name any specific groups to be mindful of, the threat of racial extremism remains the most dangerous threat to the US and Americans altogether. With the war in Ukraine, foreign racial extremist groups could gain battlefield experience and weapons, and export that capability to US-based affiliates. While tracking this war, it's really hard not to encounter some of these groups, since they do exist on both sides. The Ukrainian Azov Battalion is probably the most famous, but you don't have to look much further to find Russian equivalents where Nazi iconography is displayed in uniform patches, tattoos, flags, and equipment. The final section of this report is conflicts and fragility, starting with potential flashpoints for incoming conflicts, the largest being tensions between India and China over the Himalayas. This has had some interesting moments in recent history, with the clash between Indian and Chinese troops resulting in a Chinese retreat from an attempted land grab. However, these clashes uniquely occur without firearms. They're all fistfights and battles with batons and shields as part of a mutual agreement to avoid the risk of escalation. The next largest potential conflict is right next door between Pakistan and India. Pakistan is a Chinese ally and harbors a tense history and distrust of India, which is mutual. With the militant groups that Pakistan allows to target India, India has shown it will respond more forcefully, which makes this and the Himalayan standoff a potential two-front conflict for India among three nuclear powers. Another key conflict area to monitor is Armenia and Azerbaijan, which I'm filming this in late March, so for all I know this may have actually already kicked off again by the time that this video actually releases. We've talked a little bit already about why this conflict could re-emerge in the Russian section as well. Finally, this report finishes by covering areas where internal strife and governance challenges are brewing. Areas like Iraq, Afghanistan, Burma, Africa, Latin America, and Europe. We live in a dangerous world, and it will continue to get more and more dangerous as the fallout from COVID continues to fall. as well as the impact of the war in Ukraine is felt. China is a growing world power with the ability to meet the US competitively in many key areas. All the while, climate change may speed up the rate of chaos and conflict. That's all pretty dark. So here's a good fat cat. I'd love to hear your thoughts about this report down in the comments. What threats do you think were left out? What threats do you think will resolve themselves within the next year? Let me know below.